Koei Nakachi tells the story of Shoya Ishida, a high schooler dealing with the aftermath of his bullying of a classmate in primary school. His victim, Shoko Nishima, was a deaf girl who recently transferred to the school, and for some reason her disability gets under Ishida's skin, and due to a mix of him being unable to express himself and wanting to play up to his friends, it basically leads him to picking on her and eventually physically hurting her. Yeah, this escalates after a time, which and results in her transferring schools, as well as his friendship group shunning Ishida through the rest of primary school, middle school, and leading him sort of quite a broken person coming into high school, which is where the bulk of the story starts. You know, with the event that now he's wanting to amend the errors of his past, and so he wants to go back and talk to Shoko and sort of make amends, or at least just confront her. I'd say the greatest quality of this film are those two characters, or mainly just how the film works to get you into the mindset of these characters. It's no sort of surprise that the general theme of the film is communication and the characters struggle with it. As on the surface level, obviously, you have Shoko's deafness and how everyone has to sort of adapt to being around her. But on a deeper level, it's also about how the characters fail to convey what they want or have their messages misconstrued. The most obvious effect from Ishida's side is that we have the X's on everyone's face, as you've probably already seen in the trailer, which honestly do overstay their welcome as the film goes on, but in the earlier moments I think it really helped to solidify how separate he feels and how rewarding it is when those barriers eventually come down. However, it just basically works as a one-trick pony effect that if it wasn't as overused, maybe the effect would have had more emphasis towards the end. However, it was just that it kept coming up and they never really did anything new with it once, like I said, the trick was established. It got a bit tired later on. If you want to look at sort of a very similar concept, I'd look into Anomalisa from last year, where they had the trick where every single background character has the exact same face as their puppets, and they have the exact same facial features to convey how bored the main character is of the people around them. There's also other techniques, such as Ishida imagining the voices of those around him and sort of choices of framing that separate him from everything else, which might not be the most original ideas in themselves, but they all fit together to create an overall effect of solitude, as well as conveying the sense that at some point it stopped being genuine seclusion and more of a mental issue, which I think is really the key to understanding his character. You know, sometimes it's very easy for films to convey when people are literally being shunned, but when they're shunning themselves from society, it's that much harder to convey, and I think that this film did that. And in some ways, I think conveying isolation or self-isolation better than I've seen before. For Nishimiya, the framing is also used to emphasize her condition, tending to focus on body language in conversations rather than purely just facial expressions. This is somewhat of a trope of anime in general, as it's just kind of easier to cut away to something stationary than to animate the whole conversation. But on the other hand, it's also a trope of the director, Naoko Yamada, who is also very known for doing these very realistic body language shots in her projects. And I think that that's definitely in full force with this, not only just because of, like I said, how Nishimiya as a character obviously relies a lot more on body language than most, it's also interestingly ties the two characters together in how, because Ishida's sort of staying away from people and at the point where he can't even look people in the eye, thus the X's, it's all about how he's looking away from people during conversations, and it does a lot of point of view shots that it does stuff that other projects it could be you could see it as a trope or a way of kind of cutting costs and just making things easier. However, in this one, not only is the animation superb in those moments, but it's also they do interesting things with the conversation which makes them more than just the standards cutaways, such as when Ishida's looking at the floor and you'll see the reflection of the characters in the floor as opposed to just a shot of his feet. Not only is it an interesting shot, but it gives more insight into what he is feeling right now and how he's witnessing the scene. I also really liked with this is that, sort of as a similar note, is that the sign language moments aren't subtitled. Obviously this effect is a bit lost on English viewers as we have subtitles anyway, but it was still effective to draw the audience into their conversations that much more, as it just makes conversations in the film that much more involving, because you're seeing people's reactions to things before you even know what they said, or you're trying to figure out yourself what the person said. And as the film goes on, you get these little rewarding moments where you start picking up bits and pieces of the sign language yourself and can understand brief moments in conversation conversations, and so it's a very simple way of just getting you that much more involved in the world. And as well, it also works well with the characters, because you can use their knowledge of the language as a reflection of their investment in the relationship, not just the main two, but also side characters as well. I'm going on this point way longer than I thought I would. One last point I wanted to mention about how the film kind of gets you into the headspace of the two characters was the score. Overall, I really did love the musical composition for the film. With the score, sometimes they did very interesting effects on the tracks. So typically in scenes where there was either a communication breakdown or something similar, they would have tracks using high twinkly piano notes, which is the norm for emotional scenes, I know, but what they do is they add a layer of sort of really warbled, corrupted sound in the lower frequencies, almost like you downloaded a really crappy MP3 off the internet, and it just really worked with those scenes, not only because it just gave that score a bit more depth to it, which really worked in the cinema, but also it was such a small detail that wasn't inherently noticeable, and again adds that level of empathy for the characters, as its obvious comparison is Nishimiya's hearing aid, and like I said, it comes in at moments of miscommunication, which is the very obvious theme of the film, but it was a subtle way to do that, which I feel like not many people would instantly notice, and it's that much more rewarding. Unfortunately, that's not all the notes I have with the sound, as there are a few scenes where I found the sound design had a really noticeable drop in quality. Like, not the actual, like, fidelity of the sound, but in occasional scenes it just felt like sound files were either just missing, like you were seeing things that would obviously make a sound just being silent. And going off what I've already said, you could think that it was just an effect that I was misunderstanding, but they use silence to emphasize points throughout, which is, it's rather obvious when they do it. Like, it's effective, but still obvious. And these problems are also present in scenes where Nishimiya is not even present, so there's no basis for that effect. 95% of scenes were fine, of course. It's just that I don't think you should ever have to be thinking about the lack of sound design mid-film, and it just took me out of those moments, which was a shame. However, my biggest problem with the film is that it feels like an adaptation. It feels like a series on fast forward, and most notably in its characters. Now, I don't think there's anything particularly bad about the characters in this, bar one or two that have the personality of cardboard. I have to quote Harrison's recent review of The Great Wall by just saying, it's just that there's so many of the fuckers. At least four or five characters could be completely removed from this film with no detriment to the story or the main characters' arcs whatsoever. It's not just the fact that they're in the film that's a problem. I have no problem with films with large casts if they make their time on screen either worth it for the entertainment of the audience or of relevance to the overall film, but they're just there. They're just background noise at best and wasting time at worst. Before I go into why I think they're there, I do just want to reiterate that I'm not talking about all of the secondary characters, as I found a few had good chemistry, were genuinely enjoyable to watch, and served a purpose for the film's theme and main characters, which again filled all that criteria that I just said a moment ago. Actually, you know what? I just looked up the poster of the film, so here you go. This is the easiest representation of who could be taken out of this film, and that's not even all of the characters that I would take out of it. Right, anyway, back to the point. Why do I think they included them in the first place? Well, like I said, it is an adaptation, and I feel like these characters are just sort of the baggage that has come with that. From my brief look into sort of researching the original manga series, I can see two things. Firstly, that the second half structurally is changed quite a bit, and while I can't comment on the quality of that change, of course, at least proves to me that they're not afraid to take risks with this adaptation. On top of that, I'm also aware that the director and Kyoto Animation have worked on adaptations in the past that have been praised both in their own right and as adaptations that improve on the original. However, in these cases, as it was TV series, they had room for the original material as well as additional content, and this just isn't the case with the film, as if you have more original content than the film time will allow, you're just taking away. You can't really add much at all. The second thing that I took away from the original was the layout of the series, where it seems very clear that it very much fits into an episodic format. After the initial setup of Ishida confronting Nishimiya, they are slowly introduced into a wider circle of characters that add to their friendship group. Each one of these friends has their own issues, sometimes directly linked to Ishida's past, and these problems reflect on similar problems in the main characters. And my interpretation is that they work together piece by piece to help these friends' problems, in the process helping themselves, and eventually by the end the group sort of come together as a whole. So each of these separate characters represents a problem, and by the group fixing that problem, it also inherently helps the main characters themselves and progress until the eventual conclusion. The problem with A Silent Voice is that it knows you can't tackle all of these individual stories or you'll leave no time for the central conflict. But on the other hand, it doesn't want to give up these precious characters, either because they're relevant to the themes or simply because fans like them. So what you get instead is this assortment of rushed side pieces that show up all the time, sometimes literally for no reason, and they attempt to steal the show for a minute, before disappearing until the next time they're needed for drama. If I sound quite annoyed by this, it's not necessarily that these characters caused that annoyance, with the exception of that one red-headed guy in particular, who I will refuse to name, because that implies he has some sort of character, as well as a few not on the poster. But it's just they take away from this main story, which I believed needed more time anyways. Moments that could be spent developing the central relationship of the film are instead thrown away to these side characters and just squandered. This is made worse by the fact that I found the ending to actually be just a bit of a letdown, not due to the actual actions themselves. I think they were well executed, but it's just that there wasn't enough to build up to the events due to all the messing around with the less important characters. And so not only did the events of the ending seem to come relatively suddenly, but they also felt rushed. There were rewarding moments near the end, of course, however it's just by that point I felt like the film had lost its focus, and sadly made me more disconnected from the main characters as opposed to connected to the group, which is what I think they wanted to achieve. That's really all my points with it. I didn't want to talk too much about the story because, like I said, it is a manga series, so if you want to know the story, it's already out there if you want to read it. And to be honest, I think the trailer seems pretty obvious the direction where it's heading. If you were confused by the amount of negative points I had on this, I suppose I could do the typical parent line of I'm not angry, I'm just kind of disappointed. I still really enjoyed this film. I'd say it was a 7 out of 10 if I had to rate it. It's just that I felt like I was constantly spotting moments where I thought, if only you'd just done this, or if only you'd just done that. And I was just thinking throughout it, there's a much better TV show in here than there is a film. If they were to ever say, we're remaking this as a TV show, I would happily watch it. And all my positive points still stand as well, which are the central characters, how they're portrayed, the direction, and the score, which are all lovely. As well as just, yeah, the general animation and the general look of it. I mean, it's Kyoto Animation, so it just generally looks amazing, and I found that some of their projects it looks like they over-animate a bit, like it looks too glossy because they're adding so many effects, and I did sort of find some of the stuff where they tried to make it look a bit like a real camera, I did find that a bit jarring, but mostly I felt like it was quite toned down from like where they shove loads of bokeh on the screen or something like that, and I really liked that. I felt like it was a comfortable middle ground. Great. If you want to complain about how I didn't quote-unquote get it in the comments, be my guest, and if I got something genuinely wrong, I'd like to hear about it. If you did like my review though, and want to see more, there'll be a link on screen or in the description to other anime reviews, there's a playlist, or you can just check out our channel.